Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And yeah, as just mentioned, I originally thought about talking about recent Supreme Court decisions, but as I thought more about them, I thought there's some interesting historical ironies. So I wanted to kind of go back a little bit in time. So I'm going to talk about a couple of historical moments kind of leading up to the current moment. And by the way, can everyone hear me? We're good. Okay. And particularly going to hit the 19th century for a bit and a little bit of the 1960s civil rights era, and then talk a little bit about the current Supreme Court. But one of the things I started to think about as I thought about the Supreme Court is one curious feature of it is that it is majority Catholic. And that would have been very strange to the framers of the Republic, who might have been very suspicious of Catholics. But we have in Roberts, Alito, Thomas, Kavanaugh, Barrett, and Sotomayor, all are currently identified Catholics. Gorsuch grew up as Catholic, now he identifies as Anglican. But I'm interested here in how Catholic identity has changed over time from a very visible religious minority in the 19th century that confronted a lot of anti-Catholic prejudice with the charge, for example, that Catholics were loyal to a foreign pope that could never be truly American. And one irony is that many of those same conservative Protestants who would have been making those charges in the 19th century are some of the biggest fans of the current Supreme Court, right? So what happened to that anti-Catholicism in American life? And if anything, a lot of the conservative Protestants would be critical, say, of the current president for not aligning his views with the church more clearly. So I want to investigate here how changing religious identities have affected religious freedom, something that's interesting to me, both in terms of the changing place of Catholics in American life, but also in terms of changing ideas. This is what I'm going to try to focus on today, of social equality and freedom, and how equality and freedom play off each other. And some of what I've been thinking about recently is how the civil rights era affected a lot of how we think about religious freedom. So a lot of the classic religious freedom cases come from this moment in the mid-60s, early to mid-60s, where there's a lot going on in civil rights. And it's a lot of the same court is sort of working through a lot of these things. It's how did civil rights get imagined also in terms of the rights of religious minorities? Okay, well, to go back in time, where I want to begin, these are some of the questions I want to get to, is with a guy named Thomas Wall, who and this is a story I'm borrowing here from John McGreevy's study of Catholicism and American freedom. He's a 10-year-old Irish Catholic immigrant to Boston, and in the Boston schools in 1859, began the day by reciting the Ten Commandments. So it's pretty common in public schools, did not necessarily have separation of church and state that we imagine today. And Catholics, however, had a problem with this. Now, they didn't have a problem with the Ten Commandments themselves. They objected to the King James version of the Ten Commandments. And this was a kind of notably Protestant Bible. And they objected to biblical instruction from Protestant teachers. This should be done in catechism led by priests. And so a Jesuit priest then instructed young Catholic boys like Thomas Wall not to recite the Ten Commandments, right? Thomas Wall, being a good Catholic boy, follows the priest's instructions and refuses to say it. Teacher doesn't know what to do, calls in the assistant principal. The assistant principal intervenes and decides to beat him with a rattan stick for 30 minutes until he bleeds. Right? Now, Thomas Wall's father is not happy about this. He sues in the court for excessive force. The court fines for the school and the assistant principal on the grounds that it needed to protect religious liberty. Okay, let that sink in. Right? So the kid needs to be beaten to say the Ten Commandments. Otherwise, that would hurt potential religious liberty. Right? So what's going on? Now, in the court's reasoning, we have to go back to 1859, the Ten Commandments were non-sectarian. Everybody believes this, right? This does not favor any particular religion. Therefore, if Wall was not allowed to say the Ten Commandments, or did not require to, he was doing so for specifically Catholic reasons. And this threatens the religious neutrality of the school. Right? Once again, we're having to go back in time. So, and here's Henry Durant, who is kind of arguing for the school. made this claim here. There's a large, his argument against Wall got reprinted. It says, ours is a government of the people, a government of men, but of free men, and that dark and dangerous power, which under the guise of religion would grasp the scepter of the state, can never, never be tolerated. Now, this is why Wall needs to be forced to say the Ten Commandments once again, because otherwise we would lose potentially religious leaders. So Durant's argument was the United States is a Christian country, specifically a Protestant country, where what he called Saxon Bible is a crucial part of the national character. And if the Catholics want to use another Bible on their own time, that's fine. That's their right. He didn't object to their free exercise. But a public school must reflect the will of the majority. For a Catholic minority to challenge the curriculum and remake the rules is a threat to religious freedom. Now, the court's thinking on this is going to change dramatically a century later. And my thesis here is that changing ideas about social equality and how one thinks about minority groups is changing a lot as well. But for the courts of the late 20th century, forcing a child to recite the Ten Commandments would be a violation of the free exercise of religion. So why was this not seen this way in 1859? Well, what I think was going on is that what happens in the Wall case is when some group that is in a statistical minority or is registering some complaint about inequality, that complaint is taken as a plea for special privileges. That is, Catholics want something to be, they want to be treated differently. They want rights that other people do not have, because the majority, in this case a Protestant majority, does not see themselves as benefiting from an unequal system that excludes others. They see Bible reading in schools as neutral and inclusive, right? So Catholic protests against inequality then were framed as pleas for special rights for Catholic children and a power play by the Catholic Church to influence the public school. Now, what was really going on behind the scenes here? And here is this is actually from several decades later, but it's a classic illustration of sort of anti-Catholic nativism in the US. And there you have these crocodiles coming up on the shore, and there's the kind of papal hats that are in the form of crocodiles. And so really what this was about was know-nothing or nativist hostility to immigrants, largely, especially in the 1840s and 1850s. Thomas Wall himself was from Kilkenny in Ireland. It was the great unwashed, heavily drinking, often poor Irish immigrants who were not fully American, and people wondered whether they could ever be fully American. So, but Catholics at the time did try to use religious liberty in their own defense, but asking a kind of what you might call a sociological question. That is, wait, who is actually in power here in these schools? Protestants did not need the protections that Catholics were asking for because it was their Bible being read in the schools at the beginning of the day. So they didn't need special rights for special needs. And so Catholics argued that this was not neutral and not inclusive. But if we fast forward then to a century later, the court that by that point has moved away from 19th century idea that, say, non-sectarian is not established religion. But what I want to keep in mind is at one point we have a group saying, hey, wait a second, the people in power think they're being neutral and inclusive, but they're not. They're actually favoring something very particular. And that over time, Catholics might come to be on the other side of that divide, right? And that's kind of what I'm prefacing with the current Supreme Court. They might no longer be worried about this and therefore be much more comfortable with promoting a kind of non-sectarian, inclusive religiosity because they think they can benefit from it. But so with expanding ideas of religious free exercise, particularly by the time you get to the 1960s, courts are now citing Buddhism and Hinduism and even secular humanism as different forms of religion. So what counts as religion is much broader. And they also develop a more expansive view of what counts as religious establishment. That is reading the Ten Commandments in schools would be an establishment of religion. And so they worry then that state preferences for religion favor some people over others, and this then is applied to schools as well as other state institutions. And this is the result, I think, of changing ideas about equality. It no longer works to say the state endorses a majority view and just tolerates minorities, right? That no longer works. And you can see this especially in the religious freedom decisions made by the Warren and Burger courts of the 1920s. So it was just Chief Justice Warren and then later Burger. They often made a lot of assessments of social inequality in their decision-making to protect minority rights from state and local majorities. And they also started to question whether founding principles of equality needed to be revised, right, in a lot of ways, both in terms of civil rights, but also in terms of religious freedom. So a number of the big cases from that era, one of the big ones was Engel v. Vitale in 1962. And this was a case in which the regents of the state of New York tried to write a prayer, right, which is an interesting job for the regents to take on. I don't know what the USG would do. But they tried to produce a prayer for kind of religion in general. And basically here is the prayer. It was, Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon thee, and we beg thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. Amen. Right. So that was the prayer. And it was meant to include everyone, but the court struck it down, right? And so we've gone from the 10 Commandments, including everyone, to even this generic prayer, the court saying this doesn't really include everyone. What about an atheist? That doesn't include them. What about somebody who wouldn't subscribe to one God? What about them? What about somebody who's like, no, my prayer needs to be specifically Christian. It can't just, address a generic God. And so they said this violated the establishment of religion. A lot of times, a lot of Christian groups too didn't necessarily have a problem with this because the prayer was, some people called it the to whom it may concern prayer. It's like, Unitarians. But that led to another case, the Abington v. Shemp case in 1963, where there was more specifically Christian prayer. And the school district began, this is a school district in Abington, right outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, began the day with the Lord's Prayer and recited verses from the Bible without comment. And this was supposed to be voluntary because a student could opt out. And because it was voluntary, it wasn't seen as violating anybody's religious freedom. You don't have to say it. It's not like Thomas Ball, where we're going to be. But the court held, and the Shemp family challenged it. The Shemps actually were Unitarians. They had a problem with this. And the Shemps rejected this school endorsement of prayer. And the court found for the Shemps, they argued that even in the absence of direct coercion, a Christian prayer still amounted to religious establishment. It still favored some groups over others, and that was a problem, right? And this then led to another Lemon-Kurtzman test in 1971, which had to do with state funding for religious schools, but for secular subjects in religious schools. So you can pay like a history teacher in a Catholic school. And the court shot that down as well and proposed the Lemon test, which said there could be not too much entanglement. Now, that Lemon test has now been discarded by the current court, right? So now, in the wake of these decisions, you have a pushback from what are called originalists, right? Which would be the philosophy of law subscribed to by a lot of members of the Roberts Court. And an originalist wants to go back to the original meaning of the laws or the constitutional amendment. Doesn't mean that people in the past were smarter. It just means you should defer to constitutional framers or democratic legislatures rather than the judges making up their own rules, right? So the original language has been a big part of recent decisions that have pointed to history and traditions criteria for determining what the First Amendment meant in 1791 or the 14th Amendment in 1868. And of course, one irony is that the history and traditions criteria would be like, hey, wait a second, what are all these Catholics doing in the court, right? That would probably be a problem for the framers of the Constitution. But a lot of them don't see the irony of that. But originalists do claim to like some court decision, and particularly Brown versus Board of Education. I want to talk about this for a moment, because this is the 1954 decision that was cited by Justice Alito's recent Dobbs decision, the one that overturned Roe v. Wade, as it broke from precedent or stare decisis. It argued that the Brown versus Board of Education had overturned the previous Plessy v. Ferguson separate but equal test. And because that was overturned, they could overturn Roe, right? But a look at the Plessy decision poses a more complex question for the current Roberts Court. I want to go back to that decision very briefly. So this is an 1896 case where Homer Plessy, who was an African-American man who boarded a whites-only rail car in violation of Louisiana's Separate Car Act, right? And it claimed it violated his 14th Amendment rights of equal protection under the law. But what the courts found against him, right? And they claimed it didn't on this ground. And here I'll just quote it from the Plessy decision. It says, the object of the 14th Amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law. But in the nature of things, it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based on color or to enforce social and distinguish from political equality or a commingling of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to each other. In other words, what Plessy is saying is that, look, yes, you have a right to buy a rail ticket, but there's nothing in the Constitution that says you have a right to an integrated rail car, right? So we're giving you the political equality to have public accommodations, but how those are going to look is up to the voters of Louisiana, right, or the democratic institutions. And this was the basis for the separate but equal doctrine, right? And it understood that it was not socially equal. The trains might not be as nice, but social inequality is not up to the courts, according to Plessy. That's up to democratic process. Now, I think that's significant because I think the current Roberts Court is making decisions that fit that model to a large extent. Now, Brown overturned the Plessy, but the separate but equal test. It mattered for Brown that the schools were not actually equal. We need to make a sociological assessment that says these are not the same. And also that the history and traditions of the United States had been really wrong, right? They've been getting the 14th Amendment wrong for the last 80 years. And really, the history of the United States was very little guide for thinking about racial inequality or equality, and therefore we have to reject that. So the Warren Court adopts this sort of thinking, and here I'll identify basically 3 guiding principles. The court needed to protect civil rights of people from state and local majorities. The history of tradition, so that's one principle, the history of tradition of the United States, the second principle, had gotten equality wrong, and it needed to be therefore reversed. And third, the court needed to look at social reality. Are these people actually, right? And this informs the logic of what becomes known as substantive due process, which is kind of a wonky term. We can talk about that later. But if we fast forward now to June of 2022, where we have these 3 big religious freedom cases decided by the courts. And what I'm arguing basically here is that the current court is pushing back against all 3 of those principles, right? So in the Kennedy v. Bremerton decision, which is a decision that's something like Abington in a way, you have a Washington football coach who leads a voluntary prayer at the 50-yard line after a game. He was fired then by school administrators who asked him to stop doing it. But he argues that it was voluntary, which is kind of like the issue in Abington. But rather than see this as an establishment case, the Gorsuch opinion here says this is about the free exercise of the coach. He is an individual who should be able to free if he wants it. He technically does not overturn Shem and even favorably cites it. He argues simply that this was not a school-endorsed prayer. This was just an individual praying on his own, right? But one of the things I think about this, on one hand, he brings up this idea, on this understanding, here I'm quoting from Gorsuch, if you can ban a football coach from saying a Christian prayer, he says, on this understanding, a school could fire a Muslim teacher for wearing a headscarf in the classroom or prohibit a Christian aide from praying quietly over her lunch in the cafeteria. But this Gorsuch opinion is really interesting. He also talks about defending the rights of Jews to wear yarmulkes and things like that. But it raises a question about how he's analyzing social reality. In other words, is a yarmulke-wearing Jew or a hijab-wearing Muslim likely to face discrimination from a secular progressive, or is it more likely to come from a Christian conservative? Gorsuch tells us it's more likely to come from a secular progressive, that a Christian school coach leading a Christian prayer is in the interest of a hijab-wearing Muslim. What I think is going on there is he's framing this as an individual voluntary choice issue in a way that abstracts from those sociological judgments of equality and inequality. That is, the reality here might be that Christians in Bremerton, Washington, might be really the ones in control, but instead it's framed as an individual making a choice to say a prayer, right? So in the dissent, Sotomayor questions whether Kennedy prayer is really private free exercise. And she shows a picture of the players, and they're like all gathered around the 50-yard line. And she wonders whether this is truly voluntary or whether there's some real social pressure being exerted here. But what's interesting in basically what she's saying is, look, is this really going to protect religious minorities if we allow Christian majority groups to say prayers? And she thinks not, right? Because she's still working in that model of a kind of what I'm calling a civil rights model. You need to protect minority groups from state and local majorities that might infringe on their 14th Amendment rights, right? But I think it's interesting that the current court is moving away from that. And here, and I'm going to finish with this one final case, talking about the Carson v. Macon decision, which was a Maine law, also made in June of 2022, that allowed for tuition assistance for private schools in underpopulated areas. And that's specifically to Maine. It's a very unpopulated state, especially in northern Maine. And so a lot of times there might not be a public school for 60 miles away. So they will then give you some money for private schools, but only if it's a non-sectarian, by which they mean non-religious, right? And the Christian schools challenged this and said, wait, we should be able to get this money. The Roberts decision said that the Maine policy discriminated against Christian schools, okay? Which is interesting because it was a very activist decision, meaning that the court was moving in to overrule a Maine law in this case. But what it's sort of, there's a number of ironies about this that I can talk about for a long time. But one of the things that it does not consider is what are the social implications of this going to be if Christian schools in rural Maine can now get money? What is that going to do, practically speaking, to public schools, like on a realistic level? And is a Muslim in Maine going to have the same access to a Muslim school that a Christian will, right? But increasingly, they're rejecting those kinds of analysis with these decisions. That is, they're returning questions of religious freedom as well as civil rights, because I think they go together. As the Roberts Court is returning these. Sorry, I have a picture of Roberts with these. I'm making he returns questions about civil rights to state and local majorities, right? That is, the town people of wherever, or they're going to allow for a lot of now public voucher laws. So people in Alabama, the voters of Alabama want to give money to Christian schools, they can, which is going to really change the public school world. It's increasingly using American history and tradition as the guideline for defining equality, right? And that's particularly true in the Dobbs decision, which I just don't quite have time to talk about today, which is its own thing that we can talk about forever. But maybe we can discuss that more when we have our chat. But they're basically saying, abortion wasn't necessarily protected in 1868, so it's not protected today, right? So, and so when you're deferring to equality, that's really different from saying we need to rethink what equality looks like. Sorry, deferring to historical equality. And it removes assessment of social equality to treat everyone as abstract individuals making private personal choices, right? Which takes away those kind of inequality measures. And in my mind, it kind of returns to the Plessy thing that says we can protect political equality, but not social equality. So that's a pretty big charge. I'm arguing that the Roberts Court is reproducing the logic of Plessy, but I think I will end there. I think